So that was fantastic. If we could all avoid doing stupid things, as Dean said, it would be marvelous. And we'll certainly going to try in this next conversation. One of the things I love about participating in FP events is that they always encourage a wide range of views, and we certainly have that for this next panel. So I'm looking forward to a robust discussion. So let's kick it off. And Winnie, if I could start with you, I think it's worth for this conversation just having a little bit of a scene setter, because you do come from different positions, different stakeholders in this discussion, to talk a little bit about, just set the table for us. Where are we at when it comes to plastics, and what is top of mind? What do we need to prioritize in this conversation? And Winnie, I know Pew, you just released a report that was included that the EPA just referenced. So what do we need to understand about the problem?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie, for that question. So in 2020, Pew and Partners published the report, Breaking the Plastic Wave. It's a comprehensive analysis of the strategies we need to tackle the plastic pollution problem. And I want to share 3 really compelling statistics to kick us off on the urgency of this problem. So first, Pew's research estimates that today about 11 million metric tons of plastic is entering our oceans each year. To give you a sense of scale, imagine 30 pounds of plastic being dumped into the ocean along every foot of coastlines around the world. That is a sobering number. Second, if we continue along the pathway of business as usual, this number will triple by 2040. And third, the amount of plastic that will have accumulated in the ocean by 2040 will be 4 times more than what there is in the ocean today. Now, those are some sobering numbers, but Pew's research also found that there is a path for us to dramatically reduce the plastic pollution problem by 80% in 2040 with existing technology and solutions. This will require a system change whereby we implement solutions across the entire plastic life cycle, from production to manufacturing to distribution, use, recycling, and waste management. And these solutions will need to be implemented urgently and ambitiously, and all sectors have a role to play. But if we can put in place the system change approach, we can solve the global plastic pollution problem in 1 generation.
That's encouraging. We want to lean into that. We're going to talk about that system change. Laurent, every time we talk about green energy or we talk about investment flows, or green or climate, and I just did it, we go to energy, right? The energy is always the first topic that comes up. Is there enough policy attention on the issues of plastic?
I think there's a huge opportunity to do more on policy. We just published a report called the Plastic Waste Makers Index, which looks at the upstream part of the supply chain, so the plastic producers, the petrochemical companies, and their responsibility for the single-use plastics crisis, which is the bulk of the macro plastic pollution, so visible pollution. And really, single-use plastic waste is growing. There's quite simply more single-use plastic waste than ever before. When we first did our report over 2 years ago, we saw that there was 130 million tons of single-use plastics made from fossil fuels and just a few million tons made from recycled waste. So about 99% of plastics back then come from fossil fuels. 2 years later, what do we find? An additional 6 million tons of single-use plastics from fossil fuels and just a few 100,000 from recycled waste. So now we've got about 98% of single-use plastics today coming from fossil fuels, right? And so, to your point on climate, because of that, we also measured the life cycle emissions of, associated with single-use plastics, so all the way from fossil fuel extraction to end-of-life disposal. And across the industry, life cycle emissions from single-use plastics is about 460 million tons. And to put that into perspective, that's equivalent to the net emissions from the United Kingdom alone, or Australia alone. So pretty significant, right? And it's about 1 to 2% of the total carbon budget. And what we also found is that, about 60% of those life cycle emissions comes from the upstream part. So fossil fuel extraction, production, refining to polymer production. And so there's a really interesting opportunity here for circular economy solutions and policies and more recycling and more reuse to not only, solve for the waste problem, but also solve for the climate problem. Climate and plastics are two sides of the same coin, right? So policy is really, really important to fix both.
And all of the reports we're talking about, there are links on the event page, as well as FP will be tweeting them out. So feel free to get them there, and you can download them and dig into the details, because it is so important to track this. Josh, when we're talking about this, and both of you mentioned opportunity, and I find myself often these days, I interviewed Peter Diamandis not long ago, very famous entrepreneur, creator of the X Prize, who said something that I'm thinking about constantly in these conversations. Show me one of the world's greatest problems, and I'll show you one of the biggest business opportunities there is. So how is ACC thinking about this?
Yeah. Well, Maggie, thank you for having me today, and great to be with such a distinguished panel. I'm going to start off and maybe provide a couple of viewpoints that I think are very important to that topic you just mentioned. I think the first thing is we have a lot of talk today going on about what's bad with plastics, right? And I won't sit here and say there are not challenges. There are significant challenges we face. But I want to start off and remind people of a couple of things that are really important. First off, plastics are a pretty remarkable innovation and invention. Think about some of the things they do. I see that helmet sitting right there on the floor. Plastics make us safer, right? I got a 5-year-old kid at home. We're currently in the midst of learning how to ride a bike. That thing keeps her safe, keeps her family safe.
We have not planted her, by the way.
You think about it from, hygiene, personal hygiene, or hospitals, IV bags, all the things that keep you safe and sanitary. Those are pretty remarkable things. When we start thinking about plastics from a climate perspective, plastics will be a critical component to making and achieving a lot of the ambitious climate goals we have. In fact, Senator Merkley was up here speaking just a few minutes before me. And Senator Merkley, we agree with you totally. If you want to transition to cleaner energy, our industry is going to be at the centerpiece of making that happen. You lightweight vehicles with plastic components. A car today, about 50% of the components of a car are made out of plastic materials. They only make 10% of the weight of the vehicle. If you want a car to go longer on an electric vehicle or an autonomous vehicle, plastics are going to play a very important role in that. And when I think about climate in particular, our industry takes that challenge very seriously. I mean, we are working daily to make our operations more efficient, cleaner, safer. You look over the last decade or so, plastic production increased by about 4 billion pounds. In that same time, our technology, our efficiency, most importantly, our people, found ways to do that more efficiently. We reduced our carbon emissions footprint by nearly 11 billion pounds. So we're making more plastics, but we're doing so more efficiently. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion, and was mentioned here, about what do we do about plastic entering the environment, leakage into the environment. It's a huge topic. And when we think about it, you mentioned the part about business opportunity. Circularity is the business opportunity for our industry. We are investing today to make this a reality. In fact, I wouldn't say we're just investing and talking, we're actually doing it. And so when you think about those three things today, I'd remind folks about a couple things. One, plastics have made modern life very possible. You think about all of the things that we do and all of the things we use. It's made infrastructure more efficient, delivering clean water. It's made us safer. It's a key component to climate. And circularity isn't just good for the environment. It's also a great business strategy for our industry.
So, Winnie, when we think about that, clearly it has a role to play. It's part of the problem, part of the solution, I think fair to say. How can we best accelerate the transition and get buy-in from the industry? Can we lean into circularity alone?
Well, what we found is we have to implement solutions across the whole plastic life cycle and the whole plastic value chain. And we need to also evaluate what we use in our industry, in our society, and find the best material that will take us to the green transition that we are trying to put in place. So we know plastic has many uses today and that it is widely used across many sectors. But at the same time, with the growing plastic pollution crisis and the climate crisis, we have to find solutions to tackle the impact of plastic and plastic waste on our society and our environment. And we also need to think about, as the energy systems infrastructure evolves and business models innovate, what would be the best material to take us forward to this new future?
So how do we move through the transition?
So in terms of the transition, the work that the Pew research shows that we could implement solutions in 3 phases. The first would be near-term solutions that we call no-regret solutions, such as putting in place, investing in collection infrastructure, testing new delivery models, as well as putting in place, reducing and eliminating avoidable plastics and overpackaging.
Right.
The next phase would be medium term, what we call catalytic solutions, whereby we innovate and new materials and technology, where we scale up, secure large-scale funding for waste and recycling systems, as well as deploy new delivery business models such as refill and reuse systems and reverse logistics. And then in the longer term, we would put in place breakthrough solutions that would scale up these refill and reuse and reverse logistics systems globally, and where we can mainstream business models to provide packaging as service, as well as achieving a value-driven system for waste recovery and recycling.
Which makes sense. Lori, I think the challenge is you need investment across all of them now if you're going to address the gravity of the problem you just laid out. You just can't concentrate on the short term. You need to have funding throughout. What's the best way to incentivize change and make sure that we are moving across for not only a short-term Band-Aid or stopgap solution, but are focusing on the longer term too? What's the best incentive to do that?
Policy. It's really the key to solving, the failure for recycling to not scale, for biomaterials to scale. I mean, in our report, we actually show some green shoots across the industry. There are some chemical companies who are producing recycled polymers at scale, so that the solutions do exist. But interestingly, if you look at where they operate in markets and regions where there are progressive policies to support investment in waste management infrastructure to provide the feedstock for recycled material, right? So policy really is the key intervention that's required. You see it with the Inflation Reduction Act on clean tech energy in the US. The response from that, from businesses, from investors, the flow of capital now going to the US as a result, that sort of magnitude of incentives is what's required on sort of the waste management front. We need something similar on plastics, I think, on waste management, but also on the alternative space, right? So you've got some really new, interesting materials out there that can replace plastics altogether, but they are very early stage. They require a lot of patient capital, they require a lot of government support and policies. But I think, there is proof in the pudding that it does exist and that there are companies producing recycled polymers at scale. It's really just the policy intervention that's key that's going to drive that.
And it's not there yet.
No. Well, it is there in some regions, right? So in Europe, in the EU, for example, you have some policies like EPR schemes, recycled content targets. You have similar sort of policies in South Korea and Taiwan and Japan. And in those regions, you do have a bigger sort of circular plastics infrastructure, right? But we need that spread across the entire globe because this is a global problem and it needs a global solution. And kind of an opportunity right now is, of course, the Global Plastics Treaty, which is, we have 2 years in the making of developing what that is and what that incorporates. But that's a real opportunity to implement some global policies to really drive that kind of recyclability and circularity to scale.
And so that we understand, when you're talking about circularity, for people who may not be as deep in this, are you talking about through recycling? Is that the main way to achieve circularity?
Yeah, it's keeping plastics within the economy and not...
Reuse.
Yeah, reuse, recycling, but also reduce. It's ensuring that plastics stay within the economy and don't end up in the environment. That's sort of circularity, right?
Joshua, how does ACC view reduction versus circularity. I hear you leaning into circularity.
Yeah.
We understand why. What about reduction?
Yeah, well, I think first off, let's start off with a couple of things. First, when we're talking about circularity, the U.S. is going to be the global leader in circularity. And the reason for that is we have the best technology, we have the best people, and we have the best way to manufacture things efficiently and at the lowest carbon footprint. Good contrast to this was some of the work that's referenced in the Inflation Reduction Act and what's happening in Europe. I think it is a perfect contrast to global competitiveness. In the U.S., you have policymakers today who are incentivizing and promoting the transition to cleaner products. In Europe, they're regulating them out of existence with mandates and proposals that industries really cannot meet. And when you think about this huge contrast that's happening, there is a deindustrialization happening in Europe because of really bad policy. And so when we talk about policy, policy really does matter. I think it's a critical driver to doing what we're talking about. In fact, we at the American Chemistry Council, we do policy really well. We've outlined a comprehensive plan to make the U.S. that global circularity hub. It talks about using more recycled content in plastic packaging. Yesterday I was on a flight. I was telling Laurent about this. Had a chance to read one of the Minderoo reports again. They talk about a 20% recycled content target. We're actually advocating for a 30% recycled content target. And so when you pair that up and you're talking about reduce, one of the best ways to reduce the use of plastic is to keep it in the environment and use it as feedstock to make new material. We also got to promote new recycling technologies. The status quo is not working. We have to acknowledge that. There are limits to the abilities and the types of technologies that exist today to helping us achieve a lot of those ambitions. One of the things that we keep hearing today on this stage is alternative materials. And I think that is quite possibly one of the most important discussions we need to have. The data shows that alternatives to plastics are worse from a climate perspective. 13 of 14 applications tested by McKinsey show that the alternatives to plastics are worse. We have to take that into consideration. That's why in our framework, we say, let's study that. Let's not leave it to somebody who's just an independent arbiter. Let's leave it to the scientists who are the best and the brightest in our government to determine that. Because we're confident that when we do that and we measure that impact, we're going to know that plastics are better from a climate perspective. We also got to make sure that we have standards to do so. The U.S. is a unique animal within itself. We have 50 states, 9,000 recycling jurisdictions, 9,000 places do 9,000 very different things. Think about that for a quick second, how challenging that is.
Yeah.
If we want to get more material back in the system and use it as feedstock to make new material, we have to think about how we standardize some of those operations.
I believe all that intent is true and will help. Whenever I hear self-policing in industry, over the years, I think all of us feel a little bit of skepticism, or at least that a feeling that change won't happen quick enough. Because we've known this and we're facing the situation. Winnie, how can we look at that? How do we have to think about reduction versus funding alternatives? And what about the fossil fuel footprint of the alternatives right now? I'm assuming that's not static. Will that change as more investment goes there? How are you thinking about that? Or what did you find when you were looking into this issue?
So I want to highlight the need for reduction. Of course, we need solutions across the whole system and for circular economy. But today, globally, we recycle only 9% of the plastic that we put out into the market. And we will need to scale up waste management and recycling infrastructure, but that's a 90% gap, and this gap is growing. So reduction has to be a significant part of the mix to provide the solutions we need. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions profile for plastics, I'll give you an example. A plastic bottle is lighter weight than a glass bottle, and so therefore the transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions profile would be higher for that the glass bottle. But if we think about a different market system, whereby that glass bottle is reused multiple times, or if the energy and transportation system decarbonize, that the greenhouse gas emission profile for that glass bottle will change. So how we evaluate, whether we go with glass or paper or plastic, which material we use, will really depend on that energy future we're looking at and what would be the best material. So plastic is here right now, and there are many opportunities for us to transition to other business models and other materials.
And this is why you're talking about a system change.
Yes.
When you're thinking about how you calculate all this.
Absolutely.
Laurent, Josh brings up a fantastic point, though, that if you are talking about, in his reference to the European framework, if you're talking about bans that will not get industry on board, then you're going to lose out huge sections of the stakeholders that you need to be participating. How do we need to think about getting that cooperation on board?
I think the fundamental issue here is that plastics are just so cheap to produce from fossil fuels, right? It's about economics. So you're not going to move to a circular economy if the economics don't work, right? And so we're pushing for a balancing of the economic playing field for fossil plastics versus the alternatives, right? And one of those things is to make fossil plastics more expensive, so by taxes, by polymer levies, or to subsidize the other side of it. I think it's a combination of both. But then also you think about plastics being too cheap because the full negative externalities of plastics aren't actually priced in to the material itself. So you saw, or you heard Senator Jeff Merkley just talk about the human health aspect of plastics, right, and the cost of society on that front. So I think the dialogue in the next 10 years is going to be very different to the dialogue in the last couple of decades on plastics, when previously it's been about waste and pollution. I think going forward, the dialogue on plastics is actually going to be more about the human health aspect of that. And once that price is fully priced into the plastics material from fossil fuels, that's when the conversation starts to change, and industry will have to change as well.
Josh, I'm going to let you respond to that. I don't think this is working either. Well, thankfully, I'm very loud, so I didn't even notice that my mic wasn't working. Before I let you respond, Josh, Claire, do we have any questions that we should ask?
We do. Jordan in D.C. actually has a question for the ACC. He's wondering, will the ACC ever support source reduction of plastic production? And how important is the UN's Global Plastic Treaty for you in this regard?
Great question. It all kind of ties in even to some of the comments that Laurent made. I think taxes, though, let's start off with that point really quickly. Implementing a tax on plastic is not going to solve your problem. Government does not solve your problem. Innovation in industry solves your problem. Innovation is not static, it's dynamic. Our industry is very dynamic. We're innovating today. And so when we think about applying a tax, for instance, on plastic, it's going to hurt the people who can least afford it today. You're talking about a tax on, one, how will it be implemented? Two, would the money be invested back into the system? And three, again, the alternatives to plastics aren't necessarily better. And so I just think it's really important that we have an honest dialogue around what the impact of these proposals are. The details really matter. I think in the comments about source reduction, it's a really good point. I think design is one of the greatest innovations our industry is doing. We're doing less with more today. We're using less material to meet the performance objectives of our customers with less energy and less water, and that's great, right? And so we are already reducing the amount of plastic we make because of those innovations. As we talk about circularity and using that design material I just mentioned, that's the feedstock to make new material. That's a great outcome, not just for the environment, but from a climate perspective. In regards to a global treaty, I think it's one of the central topics of our time on how we address this. And I think it really centers down to something that is really near and dear to my heart. Are we going to be competitive as a country here in the United States when it comes to domestic manufacturing? And a lot of the proposals you hear today would make the U.S. uncompetitive. We would be going down a route very similar where we would deindustrialize, much like Europe is doing, kill jobs and innovation, and most importantly, the products we make today would be made in countries with lesser environmental standards than the U.S. So we have to weigh all of that. A global treaty is vital for a couple of reasons. One, we need to build waste management capacity, not just here in the United States, but around the world. 3 billion people lack access to proper waste management. That's completely unacceptable. And so we need to start and understand when there is leakage into the environment, it occurs because of this. Two, we have to understand that when we're talking about a global agreement, the waste management, the systems, the technology, the people are very different in a country like Indonesia than here in the United States, and even in a state like Indiana. So a one-size-fits-all approach to a global treaty won't work. We need appropriate standards. We need national action plans to do that. We need to make sure that we're incentivizing circularity, not regulating industry out of existence.
Laura, do we need a global standard so that everybody is operating off the same playing field? I mean, this has been the holy grail when you're talking across sustainability. Is everyone being measured by the same set of rules?
We definitely need a global standard to make a level, playing field for everyone, which is why the global treaty is a huge opportunity. One push I want to make on the global treaty is that we hope it's based on science, right? We want science to be front and center of policy making, because you cannot argue with science. In the same way you have with climate change, you've got the IPCC, scientists, right, and policy coming off the back of that. The plastics treaty needs to have the exact same, right? We need to listen to the science behind it from both the waste perspective, the climate perspective, and also the health perspective.
Absolutely. Winnie?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. I couldn't agree more with what Laurie just said, that we need a science-based global treaty. And we also need to have certain metrics. And I'm excited to share about an initiative that Pew and our partners, the Minderoo Foundation, CDP, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has launched. And it is an initiative where we have included plastics questions in the annual questionnaire that CDP puts out to look at carbon, water, and forest footprint. So we're really excited about this initiative because it allows for greater transparency on the plastic industry, as well as allowing us to start measuring progress.
And I know within companies, if you can measure it, you can manage it. And that getting your head around that is often the first step as well. Josh, something I'm sure you hear about.
Measurement is one of the biggest challenges. I would love to commend Senator Carper and Senator Capito. They're leading a bill that just passed the committee today that really talks about the need for data. Yeah. If we don't have good data, we can't measure and know if we're making progress towards our goals. So I really want to commend that type of leadership, what's going on there. I do also want to make something very clear to your question. We are very strongly in support of a global agreement for plastics. And I want to be very crystal clear about that, because we are a global industry. We want to make things better and more efficient. And the aspirations we have aren't limited here to just the United States. You talk about the transition. We're investing today. $8 billion of our industry investments are already happening to achieve circularity. Partnerships all across the globe and here in the United States are happening. You have Waste Management and Dow working together to figure out how do we collect more of the hard-to-recycle plastics in other parts of the country. That's an incredible partnership. Partnerships need to be a big piece of that global treaty. Public-private partnerships in particular. Industry and innovation is key to that. And those partnerships and those relationships on the ground are what's going to make that treaty such a reality.
Absolutely. I think we might have time for one more quick one if we have one. No pressure, Claire.
Absolutely. So just following up on the plastics treaty, Arthi from Washington State would love to know what you all would like to see from the UN Global Plastics Treaty in order to really achieve our climate goals.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'll do that for time purposes to Laurie and Winnie, since I think you just sort of gave your answer.
Yeah, just given time, I'll be quick. In our report, the Plastic Waste Makers Index, we make a ton of recommendations on what we think should be included in the Plastics Treaty. But again, I want to stress that the critical inclusion I want to make right now is on science, right? You cannot argue with science, and we need to have science as the basis for policy making for this industry. And I think, just like we have in climate, the same is needed. And I'm going to pass it on, but that's a really important point I want to make right now. And I think we need some global policy interventions as well. We kind of push, as a matter of urgency, on a polymer levy, right, to kind of limit fossil fuel plastics production, to make it more expensive, to level the economic playing field as another key kind of inclusion in the Plastics Treaty. But please do read our report because there's a lot more recommendations in there as well.
Winnie?
I second what Laurie just said, science being informing the negotiations, and also to underscore the findings of our report, Breaking the Plastic Wave, that we need a system change, we need solutions implemented across the entire plastic value chain, entire plastic life cycle. And based on our findings, that those efforts need to be equal upstream and downstream. across the plastic life cycle.
And I think the only way we're going to get there is to do what you're doing right now, is for people to sit around the same table or on the same panel and have very frank discussions on what every stakeholder needs in order to be able to move forward. So thank you all for participating today.
Appreciate
it.
Thank you.
Thank you.